But anyway, you can go to the GitHub repo. That's where you can find me online. I've been doing this since 2010. And I am still doing it because I love development, I love open source, and I do love Drupal. And the way that I do it is that I am a back-end guy. I'm a code monkey. I use Drupal as a framework to build custom web applications for clients. But enough about me. Let's talk about you. This is directed towards people who are beginners at Drupal 8 development. And by beginner, that could even include the fact that you've never used it before, that you're that beginner in it. So you're in a good place if you're interested in learning about Drupal 8. If you're already an expert at Drupal development, then you can check whether anything I've said is a lie or misleading today, and you can speak up. What you want to be doing is getting a handle on Drupal 8 development at a high level. You're not going to become an expert in Drupal 8 development in the next, whatever that ends up being, 39 minutes here. When you want to be doing it is as soon as possible. And where you're going to get a chance to start building your knowledge is during this presentation. Why you want to get familiar with Drupal 8 is that not only does it make you more marketable as a Drupal developer, it's going to make you more marketable as a web developer on the whole, because with Drupal 8, you're now actually learning some modern web development best practices. And you're not learning only all of these Drupal-y things that when you talk to somebody else, they're like, what? What's hook menu? Like what? You're learning stuff that actually applies to other web development. And how you're going to get a chance to start learning that is that, yes, there will be code in this presentation. We will be looking at code samples. So again, this is geared towards developers. So what exactly is this presentation? It's a brief introduction to the basic and highly used patterns in Drupal. Okay, brief, high level, ripping through this really quickly. So you got the repos available to you so you can check stuff out more later on. What it is not, this isn't going to be a comprehensive unearthing of every single thing that you would do in Drupal 8 development, including all of the trickiest edge cases that require, you know, crazy type of things that you'll need to do. This is meant to be like the 80% of things that you're probably going to be doing for most of your time. The other 20%, we're not really going to be worrying about. So having gone through that, I'm going to assume that if you choose to remain in this session and play along, that all this seems fair to you and you're good with what I'm about to cover. So if it's not, I won't be offended if you decide to get up and leave and go to a different presentation at this point. Was there a question? Okay, I thought we had a question out there. All right, so what am I going to be talking about on OOP? So I will be looking at things like what's an interface, what's a class, what's an abstract class, how do we use traits, what is this dependency injection thing, and exactly how do I create a service? Like what are services? What I won't be getting into when I'm talking about OOP is this is what all the cool people do, and anybody who does anything otherwise in OOP is an absolute idiot, and you should be excommunicated from the PHP community, okay? This is like basic OOP concepts that you need to understand so that you can make your way along. When I'm talking about design patterns, I'm going to be talking about like the Drupal 8 patterns that you will find over and over again when you're doing module development. So I'll be looking at things like YAML, files, services, plugins, the service container. I will not be looking at like the gang of 4 object-oriented design patterns. While Drupal 8 does actually make use of many of those design patterns, that's not the focus of this presentation to say this is an example of a factory, and this is an example of the decorator pattern, and this is an example of the adapter pattern. Okay, this is going to be Drupal type of patterns that they use that you're going to that kind of becomes like your stub code that you'll use repeatedly when you do this. When I'm talking about Drupal 8, we're looking at specific examples of Drupal 8 coding that are going to help you get up and running. This is not a class on site building in Drupal 8, so we're not going to be talking about users, roles, permissions, views, multilingual, and all of that kind of stuff. So Right now, this presentation is being brought to you in Drupal 8 via a module that I've written in Drupal 8. And I do actually intend for the module to become a contributed module on Drupal.org. There is a module in this namespace already, this presentation namespace. It was written for Drupal 6. It was never ported to Drupal 7. Their vision of what they did in Drupal 6 is somewhat different from what I've got going on here, but there is this GitHub repository. Feel free, please go to the repository, file issue queues, file a pull request, help me make this presentation better, help me make this module better, so that we can contribute it back to Drupal.org. But I am actually using this module to run the presentation that you're watching right now. So let's start taking a high-level look at what we've got when we're writing modules in Drupal 8. Everything now has, instead of our .info files, we've got our .info.yaml file. That's modules and themes. This is where we got some of this consistency and some of these patterns that you're going to start seeing in Drupal, is that now when you define things, you have your .info.yaml file. And it's pretty nice seeing this consistency. We're not going to actually look at my info file because it's pretty self-explanatory. Look in the repo. We will look at my services YAML file because I have written a service for this. We'll look at a routing file because that table of contents was a controller that needed a routing. We'll look at a libraries YAML file because I do actually have a library that is managing the fact that I've got this tiny bit of JavaScript that allows me to reveal these bullet points here. And I did need to write a .module file because of the fact that I needed to make use of a hook for a template suggestion. So we're going to have a look at all of those things. So right away, what I will give you, the first image up here is that there's an organizational structure that you follow for this PSR4 namespacing when you're doing stuff in Drupal 8. And so all of these files that I mentioned right now appear right in your root folder of your module name. And that's pretty much the only things that you're going to see in the root. So anything that you're going to see in the root is actually there right now. I've used pretty much everything you're going to end up putting in the root of your folder. So speaking about services, let's launch into services and get an idea of what they are and where you would use them. So you've already been seeing services in action in this presentation. If you recall the previous slide, when we were doing the high-level look, you would have seen that there was the link for the previous slide, and then there's the link for the next slide. What you're actually seeing there is I've written a plugin, I've written a block, and it's a configurable block, and the block says, do you want me to display the previous slide, or do you want me to display the next slide? The way this slide gets its information is by calling a method on my presentation manager service. So there's a service in action right there, is the fact that you've got those links. Another area where you're seeing a service in action is that you see I've got this block that's in the bottom, which is actually a context-aware plugin, and that is gathering the images that are attached to each of my slides, and then they put these images into the block. That block is using a method from my service to find out all the stuff that's supposed to get put into that block. This is one of the patterns in Drupal 8, is the idea that you want to have like thin controllers, you want to have very focused message, you want to have the separation of concerns, and so you want the things that you're writing to be focused on doing one thing, doing it very well, and you don't want to have a bunch of like involved logic in things like your controllers and your plugins. Services is where you really put most of your logic to keep things clean, okay? So this is what I'm talking about. One of the patterns is the way that you organize where you place your code and what does what. So there's a service in action. You saw the service in action with the table of contents in the beginning. That's a controller. The controller calls a method on my service to get the table of contents. And let's start taking a look at some of this then. So the service that I wrote is called Presentation Manager Service. And you will notice that it implements my Presentation Manager Service interface. We're going to look at interfaces on the next slide. What we're going to look at right now is these methods that I've been mentioning to you. So I've got this create table of contents method. That method is used to create the table of contents. So my controller makes use of this service, calls the create table of contents method on it, and ta-da, it gets what it needs so that it can display the table of contents. I mentioned that there was the get previous slide and the get next slide. Those configurable blocks, they're very simple plugins. If you go into the repository and you look at it, the amount of logic that's in that block is like a couple of lines of code. so that you can get that render array that goes in there, because the brains are really happening based on what's going on in this service. So it makes reading your plugin so much easier. The services kind of do everything that you need them to do. And then finally, I mentioned that there was how I've got this context-aware plugin block that's doing the slide images. Here's my method for getting the slide images. So those are all the methods that I have in the service right now. Let's take a look at what is this thing called an interface. Why do you use interfaces? What exactly are interfaces? Why do we need you? So an interface can be thought of as a blueprint or a contract. The interface specifies that any class that is going to implement this interface must actually define these methods. And so when you use something that implements an interface, you know exactly what to expect. When you use my service that implements this interface, you know exactly what methods you're able to call because you just read the interface. They're great for documentation, they're great for understanding things, and what they're even greater for is for dependency injection. And we're going to look at dependency injection in a while, and you're going to see how an interface makes dependency injection possible and manageable. So you saw my presentation manager service. I'm going to show you what the interface looks like right now. If you looked at the way that I declared my presentation manager service, it said class presentation manager service implements interface. The way we define an interface is instead of using the keyword class, we use the keyword interface. And now we're defining an interface. As I mentioned, interfaces are only a blueprint or a contract. There's not actually any logic in there. So what things look like in your interface is that you are defining the expected methods that will be defined elsewhere. And so what we do have is we've got our doc blocks inside our interface. That's why you're seeing all of these @inherit doc in other places, because when you're implementing an interface or when you're extending another class that's got that documentation, there's no need for you to write that documentation again. The documentation is right there in the interface. So you just can use that @inherit doc notation. And then all your interface does is says, hey, you need to define this table of contents method. And what you'll put in your doc block is like, what are the parameters that I'm expecting? What are the things that I'm going to return from this? What's the purpose of this method? So that's where we're talking about the table of contents. And then if we look at the other parts of the interface, that's where you see I'm defining my other methods as well. So one of the things that you're noticing I have to do here is that every time I want to do another image, I'm having to escape out and then I click on a new image. I only had so much time to get ready to write this module and do this presentation. A bit of functionality that I would actually like to add to this service is that it's sort of like when you've got your color box image gallery, that you've got your previous and your next links within your image so you can get from one image to the next. So at such a point that I'm actually ready to do this previous image and next image, I would come back into the interface and I'd say, aha, if you are going to be implementing this interface, you also have to have a method that defines the previous image functionality and the next image functionality. So I'd come back into this interface, I would add those methods to this interface, and then I would put the actual logic in my service to provide that functionality. Okay, great. So I talked about how we defined the service and that we use the class keyword. So let's talk about classes, because I've also used this terminology about inheriting or extending things. So object-oriented programming gives you a way that you can organize your code. It gives you a way that you can inherit certain properties, that you can inherit certain functionality. And that functionality is called methods when you're dealing with that. But PHP is single inheritance, which means that you can only extend one class. When you write a class, it can extend one other class. And when we're defining classes, we will typically be, unless it's a base class, we're going to be extending some other class. And so let's take a look at an example of doing that. When you saw my presentation manager service, all you saw was it said class, presentation manager service, implements some interface. You didn't see extends anything in there because my presentation manager service is its own class. But we did see the we're seeing these modals here that have these images in there. And what I need to do to work with the modal API is that I actually need a controller that would build a page. And then when I use the modal API, that page gets displayed in a modal the way that you're seeing right now. So what's actually happening with this very image that you're seeing is that I've got a controller that I've written that's called display slide image. That class extends the controller base class. And so it inherits everything from that controller base class. And that's how PHP works. You can extend one class, you inherit everything from that class. Now you can have your whole ancestry tree that you've got this class, and there's another class that extends that class, and another class extends, and you can keep on going down, down, down the whole line. But you're in the same family tree, basically, and so it's all going to be the same type of related functionality that you're going to be seeing when you do that. I mentioned that I was going to also talk about abstract classes, so let's do that right now. What is an abstract class? So a couple things that you need to know about abstract classes. You cannot instantiate an abstract class. You can contrast that with what we call our normal classes or concrete classes. You can instantiate a concrete class, and you do instantiate a concrete class to create an object. An abstract class cannot be instantiated. It must be extended with another class, and then you instantiate that class. Also, even though it's an abstract class, it's still single inheritance. You can't extend more than one abstract class. And so it might seem kind of confusing, like, well, why would I want an abstract class then? What is this giving me? This doesn't really make any sense. What do I do with it? So, unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever, as it turns out, I didn't actually have to write an abstract class for the presentation module that I've written. So we're going to take a look at some Drupal use of abstract classes. We'll do that right now. There's like 6 or 7 slides here. I don't expect that you're going to memorize everything on every slide. I'm going to highlight some things that we're going to look at on the slides. So the abstract class that we're going to look at is this list item base. So keep list item base in your mind. You can see that actually extends another class, and we don't really care whether that's an abstract class or a concrete class. It doesn't matter. And it also implements an interface. None of that matters to us right now. The only thing that matters is that we're dealing with this abstract class that's called list item base. All right, when we look inside of list item base, I'm going to highlight a few of the functions, and I'm going to say that are methods. I'm going to say there are 3 different types of methods, even though it's not really a true statement. There's really only 2 types of methods, but I'm breaking one of them up into 2. One is this get possible values method. This is a method that's defined in our abstract class. This is a method that actually gets used straight up by all of the classes that extend the list item base class. They don't override it, they don't need to do anything with it, they inherit it, and they just use it. And everything works the way that you want to use. So this is actually the last time that we're going to see this get possible values class because of the fact that it's used straight up. You only end up seeing it in the other classes that extend it. The second type of method that I will talk about is a method that's our abstract method. This is why we need abstract classes. An abstract method is very similar to what you get when you use an interface. It's just a blueprint. It just says, hey, anybody who's going to extend this class has to define this method here. And I'm not going to define it for you because when you look at this one, for example, this allowed values description, naturally all of these things that have allowed values are going to have their own specific descriptions. And it doesn't make sense that you're going to have a function here that's defining anything because it's not going to apply to any of them. So you just say, look, you need to put this in your class. You need to tell me what the description of the allowed values are, and that's all that I'm giving you here. We can't have abstract methods inside of a concrete class. Your abstract class is where you use this notion of having these abstract methods. And so then the third type of method that we're going to look at is a method that is actually defined, but it's expected that it's going to be overridden. So this is kind of giving people a hint of, like, well, you're going to do something that's very much like this, except you're going to tweak it to your situation. And if you look at the name of this, it says cast allowed values. So what you're going to see in the example is that we're actually casting a specific type when we return this. So now let's look at those things. So we've got, we're going to get to these funny comments in a moment. These are annotations. That's in an upcoming slide. So what we're looking at now is, remember, the abstract class was list item base. We've got our class list string item. That's extending list item base. And we're not going to see that get allowed values method because it just uses it straight up. But what we will see is that here's where it is now actually defining the allowed values description. So that was the abstract method we saw in the abstract class that's now actually being implemented in a concrete fashion inside of this class here. Okay? And then finally, we will look at the example of where, even though we had a concrete method in our abstract class, here's where we override it, because here's what we actually end up doing is that we cast it as a specific data type. So, you know, the only difference here is that now we know, since this is the list string item class, that what we're returning is a string. And so we cast that return value as a string. Okay. Now, PHP is single inheritance. I showed interfaces. I showed abstract classes. And now we're going to take a look at traits, because traits help us with the fact that PHP is single inheritance. And this is one of those areas where I'm not going to get into all the flame wars. The PHP community is mixed in their opinion about traits, whether they're a good thing or they're not such a good thing. Although I think most people would agree that they can be used in good ways, and they can also be abused. So make sure you use them in the good ways. The reality of the matter is Drupal 8 makes use of traits, and I would agree that traits are useful functionalities. I actually had a good need for a trait that we're going to look at in this simple module that I've written. Traits help you get around the problem with single inheritance. You have this bit of functionality. You've got this code. You've got this method, for instance, that you want to be able to use in more than one place. Unfortunately, it doesn't tie directly to one class specifically. If you put it in that class, then that's the only place it's available. And if something else needs to extend a different class, they don't have that functionality, which would mean that you would need to put that method in another class. This is not a good principle in object-oriented programming. Remember, dry. Keep it dry. Do not repeat yourself. Traits give us the way that we do not need to repeat ourselves. It's this code that's meant to be reused in other places. So we've got it written one time, and then the places use that. Let's take a look at how we actually do that. I showed you in the beginning, my front page of my site is a controller that creates a page that's a table of contents. I also actually have a block that I've written. I haven't placed the block in this presentation, but if you look in the repo and if you actually install this and run it on your machine, you'll see that there's a block that can also display the table of contents. It's the exact same functionality that they need. But the block extends the block base, and the controller extends the controller base. So I don't have a place that I can put this method, except when I put it into a trait. So I made a trait for this table of contents functionality, and I said, here it is. Here's the method. Here's the build method. Here's how you actually build your table of contents. I can call the method anything that I want to call it. I chose to call it build because the block base actually expects that you're going to have a method that's called build to return you a render array for that block, and so build is as good a name as any other name. You can override, you can alias a trait name, you can alias any of the trait methods, so it's totally up to you what you want to call it, but there's no good reason not to call this method build. I was happy enough with it. And there it is. There's the logic that will actually take care of it uses the presentation manager service. You see it calls the create table of contents method. It gets a bunch of slides back, and now it's going to put together this render array that we're going to use. And that's what gets used in the controller, and that's what gets used in the block as well. And how it gets used is that within your class, you just use this use statement. If you've been looking at some of the other slides, you've seen namespace and you've seen use at the top on the outside of the class. Those are actually different use statements. Those are to save you from having to do the fully qualified path name when you want to use a particular class inside of your class. What this use statement is basically comparable to like a require or an include that you would use in PHP. What ends up happening here is that when the PHP interpreter is going to compile this file into opcode that it has on the machine, it basically goes out to the trait, it copies all of that stuff from that trait into the place there, and then this gets compiled right in this spot there. So that's how traits work. It's a way that you can include your properties, whatever snippet of code that you want. It just gets dropped in place. It goes inside of your class. Drupal does make a lot of use of traits, and so it's worthwhile having some idea of what's going on here? How does this thing work? Now you've gotten a chance to see it. So now we're coming back to those funny comments that we've seen at the top of some of our examples that we looked at there. And those comments are actually called annotations. We use doc blocks, and we've been using doc blocks in Drupal 8. Part of what goes into the doc block are these annotations. But the interesting thing about annotations is that they're actually not really comments. They're more like lines of code. There's, I don't know if it's Drupal or it's Symfony that provides this annotation parser that we have. But it actually reads these things and it will take action. It might do some configuration. It might actually provide some functionality for you based on the annotations that you have in your code. And so we're going to look at an example of that right now. I told you this context-aware plugin that I've written that gives me my block that I'm putting in the footer there of my slide images. So the annotation, first of all, what we're doing, there's different types of annotations and different types of plugins. And so this app block is telling the parser that this is a block annotation that we're using, and so it expects certain things inside of there. There are certain things that you can have inside of there. The ID is just a machine name. The admin label and the category appear if you're on your block layout page. The interesting piece of this annotation is that context key. That is what makes this a context-aware plugin. That annotation right there is all that I needed so that I've got some functionality provided to my block. Drupal takes care of caching that block. Drupal takes care of knowing what node is being displayed on the page. And then we can tap into that very simply by in one of our methods. Now we have this method that's available to us, this get context value. And there are other context values that you can get as well. I happen to say that my context was a node. And so when I get the context value, now I've got all of the contents of whatever node is being displayed on the page, I've got that available to my block right now, just because I used that annotation. And that's part of the power of annotations for you. It's kind of cool. I think it's kind of cool, because it looks like a comment, but then magically other stuff happens because of it. All right, now let's move on to dependency injection. If there's one thing that you remember from this presentation, it should be dependency injection. Dependency injection is like one of the biggest things that you need to know about using in your module development right now. We're going to look at 3 different types of dependency injection. One is when you've got a service that's dependent on other services, and we handle that through our services YAML file. The second one is when we've got something that uses the container interface. And honestly, the second one and the third one are really the same thing, but again, I'm setting this separation because there's a slight difference in what ends up happening. So when you use Symfony's container interface so that you can inject things, and then the third type that we're going to look at is when you use Symfony's container factory plugin interface. So let's see how we work within dependency injection, and that'll give you an idea of what dependency injection is, because that's one of those terms that, at least when I heard it, it sounds so technical, it sounds so big, it's like, oh, I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to master dependency injection. There's actually nothing to it. There's no mastering it at all. Like, it just happens. So here's this service that I've defined that we see running on the site here. It's my presentation manager service. And what I say is, Symfony, by the way, my service is dependent on another service. Here's the argument. And by using that at notation there, that's saying that I need you to provide me another service. There's like this percent notation if you needed it to provide a parameter. So we're saying, Symfony, I need this entity type manager service. So when you instantiate my object, could you make sure that I have that in my constructor? And that's exactly what we're going to see right now, is that when we look at my presentation manager service, we've got our constructor method in our object, and what ends up happening is that we get the entity type manager passed into our constructor. That's dependency injection. That's it, right there. There's an object that's being passed into your constructor, and now your class is able to use that object. The other key point goes back to what I told you before about interfaces. Notice the way that we type hint. We type hint with the interface. We do not type hint with a class name. If you type hint with a class name, you destroy the whole concept of dependency injection, because then the only thing that PHP will accept is that specific class. And now it's not pluggable anymore, because if you needed to change the way that class provided that particular functionality, you'd have to hack the class. But when you type it with an interface, anything that implements that interface, it doesn't matter who wrote it, it doesn't matter what they actually put in the logic for those methods, as long as it implements that interface, PHP's like, I'm good, I'll take it. I know that I can work with this. So this is dependency injection right there. You use interfaces, and you have some object that is passed into a constructor. And there you go. Now you're using it, you're off and running. Let's look at the difference now when, so that was the service, so it gets passed into the constructor. Now we're going to look at a controller. The controller extends the controller base. Our controller base actually does implement the dependency injection container interface, okay? Because I'm extending a controller base, that's just something that I inherit. And so what I end up having inside of my controller is now there's this method that I can use. Because I'm implementing an interface, there's this create method that I can use. And Symfony knows that that create method is going to be part of my class that I'm defining. And so what Symfony does is this. Before Symfony instantiates my class, Symfony will execute this create method. They pass us this container interface. This is Symfony's service container. You define services. I've defined the service in my contributed module. Okay, you define it through the services YAML file. So Symfony knows about all the services that are available. It puts it into this container, this service container. When you are going to be using dependency injection, Symfony will have this create method, or some of them are named create instance, but there's a method that's available to you where you say, hey, pass me, again, it's an interface, pass me the container interface so that I can do stuff with it. And what I'm doing with it is saying, Symfony, what I want you to do when you run that new statement and fire off my constructor, I want you to inject my presentation manager service. Okay, so this is how we tie the pieces together. This might look to you like, but Marc, now you're actually hard coding stuff. You have your own class, and your class is saying, I want the presentation manager service. But I thought dependency injection is supposed to allow you not to be tying things so tightly here. You just lied to me. There's a mechanism so that you can have your environment actually override a service. So when it says, you know, when it says I want the presentation manager service, what I really want you to do is use this other thing in its place. So we're not really hard coding anything here, but we still need to tell Symfony something to inject when our class is instantiated. So what happens first actually is Symfony calls this create method, and then Symfony will do the new later on, which will fire off this constructor, and our constructor gets our presentation manager service, which then we're able to use inside of this controller. And so the third one that I mentioned is when we are doing this with a block, that's where we specifically have to implement the container factory plugin interface, and that's really the only thing that's different about it, is that this is a plugin, and so plugins don't just natively use dependency injection. You have to say, I want you to implement this interface for me. And then once you implement the interface, then you have the exact same thing available to you that you've got. Again, this is a create method. There's a few other things that end up getting passed along that we don't really care about because it is a plugin, and when you run the parent constructor plugin, it needs that information. The only thing we care about in our block was, again, right here, that we wanted the presentation manager service, and then that ends up getting passed into our block when we're creating it, and then we have it available to us. So that's the 3 different types of dependency injection that you'll see. All right, now let's get into the notion of routing. In Drupal 7 and previously, hook menu took care of a ton of stuff. One of the patterns in Drupal 8 is this separation of concerns, and let's keep things thin, let's keep it clean, let's focus what we're doing. Our routing.yaml file is taking one of the things that hook menu used to do, and that's assigning a path name to what in procedural programming is a function, but in object-oriented programming is a controller and its method. That's what the routing YAML file is for, is to say when somebody visits this place on the website, make this thing run. And so what it looks like is this. There are actually 2 controllers that I wrote with this module. One is that controller that built that home page that displays the table of contents, and I'm saying if somebody goes to presentation table of contents, call this controller, which is display table of contents, and call the build method on it. The other controller that I had is this thing that is then put into the modal API. It's like, oh, here's this controller that is going to display a particular image, and you can see what's different about this one is that I do still get placeholders passed into it. I get the node ID and I get the delta of the image passed into it, but what I've done, if you look at the code, is that I've type hinted in my this method that's being called is I'm type hinting with the node interface. And so Symfony actually takes care of loading up that full node object for me and not just passing me the ID. So we can still have the same type of thing as we had done with hook menu in Drupal 7 and previously, where you've got the underscore load functionality. The same type of thing can happen with your router files in Symfony here. And that's what a router file looks like. Libraries are used in Drupal 8 to help with performance. Drupal 8 no longer loads everything on every page anymore. It loads only specifically what you need on the pages. And the way that you get Drupal to do that is by these asset libraries that you define. So what you can have in your asset libraries, you can have CSS, you can have JavaScript, and you can have JavaScript settings. I needed a library for this module that I wrote, even though in this presentation everything we're looking at is a slide, and so the JavaScript is loaded on every page, this is intended to be a contributed module. And so somebody might have this contributed module on their site, and they might only have certain pages that are meant to be slide pages, and they don't want to have this JavaScript delivered on the other pages. So we do it with our library, and we've got our library's YAML file. And so what I've defined here is I've got my library that I call presentation.slide. And all that I want to have happen is when you attach that library is that I have this tiny bit of JavaScript that I wrote that gives this functionality so we can reveal the bullet items on our unordered list. And so that library I make sure to only load when I'm on a page that is a slide. So let's look at it in a moment. Because before we get to that, because that actually ties into Twig, that gets into template suggestions and how I actually attach this. I've talked a lot about OOP right now, but not everything in Drupal 8 is object-oriented right now. There is still some procedural stuff, and namely, some of the procedural stuff has to deal with hooks. And I did need to use one of those hooks for this module. And what I needed to do was I needed to use hook theme, because I have a template suggestion. And the whole purpose of the template suggestion, we'll see in a moment, was so that I could actually attach a library. If you are working with a theme, all you need to do is put your template suggestion in your templates directory, and Drupal picks it up, and it will use that template suggestion. When you're working with a module, that's not the case. That's just sort of a bit of side information for you, not particularly relevant to this presentation, but I needed to use hook theme. And the place that that goes is inside my .module. And I don't remember if I actually did hook help for this or not. That's another thing that you would need hook for. So there is still some procedural code in Drupal 8. But let's get back to more of the fun stuff that's different. So talking about template suggestions and talking about libraries. So the templating system is now using Twig instead of using PHP template. The good news is that Twig is actually quite similar. If you know PHP and you know how to use PHP template, Twig is actually pretty easy for you to understand how to use as well. It's similar to TPL files, except it's actually easier. And one of the ways that it's easier is that when you were dealing with PHP template and you wanted to like render something on a page, for instance, let's say, is this an array? Is this an object? And like, how am I supposed to do this render or that? Like, how do I get this thing to display here? In Twig, you don't worry about any of that stuff. You've got this concatenated, like this dot notation, and you just like, I want this dot that, and Twig takes care of like, was I looking at an object? Was I looking at an array? And how do I go about rendering this stuff? So it actually ends up being quite a bit easier. And you still can override your templates. You have your template suggestions, which we're going to see. And being able to override those and know it's being overridden is so much easier in Twig, because you've got this debug functionality that you can use. It can let you know exactly what's going on a page. So let's see how we get about doing that. This is the template suggestion that I wanted to use. It's in my module/templates directory. It's this no -- slide -- full. Everything in Twig ends with .html.twig. Okay? The only reason I wanted that template file is that I wanted to use this attached library functionality so that my JavaScript is available on a page so I can reveal these bullet points. And the way that I figured out how I wanted to use that one is here. I mentioned there's a mechanism for overriding services. Well, it's in your services.yaml. This is different from your module name.services.yaml. There's this services.yaml that actually sits. In this case, I've got it sitting under sites default, because I'm not running multi-site, but if you ran multi-site, you could have like site name default. This is the services.yaml file. You can put stuff in there where you can override services. I'm not overriding services in mine though. What I am doing is that I said, gee, would you turn on Twig debugging for me? Because I want to be able to have a look at what's going on the pages. So I set Twig debugging to true, and then when we go to a page and we look at the page source, there's these comments that Twig will put into the file, and it will show you, here's the template that's in use, here's template suggestions. And so what we can see with mine, I know it's a little blurry, sorry. There's an X here that says we're using no -- slide -- full.html Twig in here. And in fact, I still have the Twig debugging on. So if we look at the page source that we have right now, you will see that it also tells you not only is no -- slide -- full the template that's in use, and here's other things that could be used, but here's specifically where it's coming from. So if you wanted to get at that file, you could get right to it and say, oh, that's why what's happening on this page is happening on this page right now, because this is the stuff that's in the template file. Right, well, there you go. I told you if I talked really fast, I could cram it into 45 minutes. I think I ran 3 minutes over, and I started 2 minutes late, so I got pretty close. As I suspected, we aren't really going to have time for questions. I'd love to hear from you, though. You know where to get in touch with me if you were paying attention on that opening slide. Please do feel free to get in touch. Ask any other questions. See me around the rest of the camp. Happy to help you out. Thanks so much for attending. I hope that this gave you a chance to see, like, yeah, actually object-oriented is pretty cool. Drupal 8 is pretty powerful. I like this. I think I want to be doing it. And then I will say, if you want to give me feedback, here's the link to do it on Joined In. And make sure to attend the sprints tomorrow.